Hello.
Hi.
I have read Adam's book. It is outstanding. It's in places it's funny, which is not that easy nowadays. And I just recommend it to all of you in this rather dark time. So we're going to cover a lot of ground and then get to your questions. But I wanted to start out with something that's in the news today that I'm sure some of you are aware of. And there are a new set of polls. Now, polls are very problematic at this early stage, but they're not irrelevant, especially if they're done in battleground states, not national polls, which can give you a very skewed picture. And the ones that are in the New York Times and other newspapers today show Joe Biden behind Donald Trump by a significant margin, like 5 points in some cases, in every battleground state except Wisconsin. So I guess my question for you, I know you're not in the Democratic Party, but do you think there should be a...
Why is that funny?
Do you think that...
You sound like my Republican friends.
So, you know, the big question now is, well, if Biden is seriously challenged or comes under pressure to drop out, that would weaken him further in the fall against Trump next fall. The argument on the other side is he's the weakest of any potential major Democratic candidate. That's what James Carville and some others say. And so the Democrats, for the sake of the country, should get going on saying he's been a very good president, but he shouldn't be the nominee. So do you think that would be good for the cause of beating Trump to dump Biden?
Well, first off, hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here. If you hear me like coughing and stuff, so about a month ago, I have a 2-year-old now, and he likes to eat and lick everything. And then that eating and licking ends up getting us all deeply sick. And even though you feel better, it stays forever. So having kids, my parents always told me, like, you're going to be sick until he's 18 years old, and I didn't believe it. Now I do. So, but look, and thanks for doing this too. It's great to be here. And yeah, I mean, look, I think it's a concern. Look, there's a couple of things that are going to come this year or next year, hopefully, which is number one, Donald Trump is going to be on trial. All that information is going to be put out in public, and that has an impact. We're still a country that, you know, maybe not in the primary, it's kind of the extremists in a primary, but in a general election, you know, it's still 51% that elect a president. And so I think once that's out there, if he truly gets charged with, not just charged, but actually convicted of a felony, I think that'll help. But my message to my Democratic friends is this: do not scoff at these polls, please, because it is really dangerous right now. And I will tell you, I think there is only one issue on the ballot in 2024. One issue, and that's it. Only one issue. I don't even care any of the other issues. The only issue is, do you support democracy or do you support authoritarianism? And that's it. That's the only thing we should be voting on.
So that issue worked well for Democrats in 2022. And there were a number of races where it was much more of a factor than people thought. And, you know, along with abortion, prevented the Democrats from suffering severe losses, as usual in midterms. Can that combination of democracy and abortion and an economy that is doing pretty well stabilize Biden? Or is his age an unfixable liability that is just going to make it worse and worse for him as time goes on?
Look, I think it could stabilize it. I mean, here's what I kind of worry about a little bit is that we're in a moment now where really issues don't matter in terms of, or achievements don't matter. You know, if you come out and say like, hey, I got this road for my district, or I stand this way, you know, does that drive people, or are people driven by, particularly on the right, are they driven by like anti-wokeism, right? Or like whatever the outrage of the day, Donald Duck or something is. And And so that's what I'm kind of struggling with at the moment is what is going to drive the electorate. And so with the economy is doing well on paper. A lot of people feel like it isn't doing well, particularly because of inflation and other things. So I think Joe Biden needs to be out there much more talking about the economy. And you know, for a while we're going to be not sidetracked because it's a very important issue, but we're going to be focused on a lot of this stuff overseas. But I think it's important to deal with the energy issue, the cost of energy, and talk about his economic plan. Let me say this. I voted for a lot of the bipartisan pieces of legislation, like the CHIPS Act. I was the only Republican to vote for that. You want to know the crazy thing? I was the only Republican to vote for the CHIPS Act. And the CHIPS Act was written mostly by Republicans, which is just goes to show kind of this moment we're in. Same with the infrastructure bill. And I think Joe Biden has a lot to talk about his accomplishments because he's a very accomplished president. But it's just the only thing I don't know is what's going to drive the electorate. The biggest thing, and why I strongly keep saying this is democracy versus authoritarianism, is the right going to turn out and be excited? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know the answer yet. The left and the center has to turn out and be excited, regardless of your feelings of Joe Biden. Because look, is Joe Biden the most exciting president? No. We need the least exciting president ever right now, right? This country's had enough excitement for a little bit.
So you have a great feel for swing voters. I mean, when you were first elected, you defeated a Democratic incumbent and ran up big totals when you were running for re-election. These are suburban or rural swing voters who are the key to this election. So how do you make the case for Biden to them specifically? Even though I take your point about how democracy versus authoritarianism is the big historical question on offer, that the stakes have never been bigger for our country, maybe since Lincoln ran against McClellan in 1864. I think that's the only comparable election in terms of the stakes. But most voters aren't thinking about the stakes. They're thinking about their pocketbooks. And so what are the best messages for, let's isolate a little bit more, women in your old district who are swing voters, who sometimes voted for Democrats, sometimes for Republicans? What's the best way to appeal to them?
Well, the issue that Democrats are losing them on right now is the issue of crime and the issue of immigration, I think. It's just and this is what I try to say, like obviously I'm rooting for Democrats, to be honest with you. And so when I say this, it's not as any kind of a slight or a hit. It's like, hey, I'm telling you, this is what they're saying, so you should listen to it. And it's like, what is that? So like on immigration, I'm very moderate on immigration. I'm for immigration reform. I think we have to do it, but we also recognize that with the border and the situation it is, the cartels, for instance, are profiting on human trafficking. Like every American should be concerned with that. I think that's a concern. I think the thing that will drive the swing voter like towards Joe Biden versus Donald Trump, and I don't mean this to be funny, it's kind of funny when I say it, but Donald Trump's literally insane. And I think people are scared of him, and they should be scared of him. And the more, as you see now, the more he's speaking, the more he's out there. Do you realize, like, what is this, a week ago? No, just 3 or 4 days ago, he had a rally in which, at the beginning, the national anthem was being sung over the phone by the January 6th prisoners in jail. And he called them political prisoners, and it's very clear that he will pardon all of them. The media doesn't cover this anymore because we're all just exhausted of it, but it's a reality. And I think once that comes out, that'll be, obviously that'll be impactful, but you have to look at the issue of crime, immigration. I think the economy are going to be the big three this year.
Is there any one thing he could do on immigration and the border that would help, address some of these problems that he's got with swing voters?
Yeah, I think, look, obviously, a full immigration reform, everybody knows what we need to do, and everybody agrees with it. Like, you do border security, you legalize those that are here, you create a better system, right? That kind of thing. We all know what we need to do. The problem is nobody wants to do it because, they want to do it, but there's a political motive to not do it because otherwise you'll lose that issue. I think what can the Democrats do is just just show probably a little more of a focus on enforcement of the current law. I think we do have to deal with this issue of asylum, because we want to be a country that's very generous on asylum. We want to make sure, though, that's being used by those that like truly deserve asylum, versus just coming across the border and saying, I fear for XYZ, therefore asylum. It's like, how do we do that right? I think those are probably some of the top things that can be done. But I'm not sure, honestly, that much is going to change within the next year or so, because this is the issue of immigration's obviously been around as a concern for 30 and 40 years. It's not like 1 year is going to make much of a difference on that.
So do you think they should get over their exhaustion and Trump fatigue and the fact that people are sick of talking about Trump, and remind everybody relentlessly that he wants to, quote, suspend the Constitution? That's a Trump quote.
Yeah.
He wants to use the office to achieve, quote, retribution, that he thinks that the January 6th insurrectionists were heroes. People forget, they have short memories.
They do.
So there's kind of two roads. There's one to go, well, no, we're going to talk about abortion and economic growth and the infrastructure project in your district. And the other is, no, we're going to beat Trump over the head. Which should be the main emphasis?
Well, you've got to be able to walk and chew gum in this case. So you have to show that you are from a governing perspective, you're able to govern. And that's one of the best things Joe Biden is able to do, is no matter what anybody's opinion is of him, that he's kind of a steady hand on governance, right? At a time when we need a steady hand. But we cannot ignore what Donald Trump is out there saying. And so I think it's going to be essential for the Democrats in their messaging to both talk about Joe Biden as the steady hand in comparison and in contrast to how nuts, and how frankly frightening Donald Trump is. The media's job, so this is always the interesting question, is should the media ignore Donald Trump or should they not? And this came up when, my current employer, CNN, did the town hall with Donald Trump, right, which I spoke out against, actually. And I say this, it's like, look, you've got to cover this. And I think in my mind, and, you're the media expert, you'd know better than I, but the media has to talk about this stuff, but it also needs to be fact-checking him at the same time. So the key is, if you're going to interview Donald Trump, you have to fact-check him in real time when he says, the election was stolen, for instance. That's going to be important, but I don't know. I do worry about people with Trump fatigue, and that Trump fatigue actually being, I don't care, we're used to something outrageous every day. And that's a worry to me, because we should never be used to hearing what we're hearing from him every day, because it is I get chills when I hear him say things, when I hear him say that January 6th was a heroic day. And so I don't have the answer to it, except we have to keep talking about it for one more year. But this is a very important year. We have to keep doing this.
How about getting CNN, or in my case, MSNBC, and other news organizations to say the ratio of horse race coverage to what is sometimes called stakes coverage is off. And instead of it being 95% about the horse race, I'm the one who started talking about polls today, and 5% about what the stakes are, it should be more like 50-50. And maybe half of our segments and stories should be about, what is this crew of far right-wing lawyers he's bringing in who want to politicize the Justice Department if Trump is elected, and what would he do about Putin if he's elected? What the actual stakes are, and because you have this foreign policy expertise, is focusing on some of those stakes both good politics and the right thing to do, or is it just the right thing to do?
Well, I think it's I think from the media's perspective, you're right. I think it's off, because the media's job is to inform you of the details, but also inform you of the details. Inform you if Donald Trump, when he's saying crazy stuff, when he's a danger to self-governance. Because I got to tell you, self-governance, by the way, I've learned in the last 3 years, is actually the hardest form of government. It's much easier to have a dictator, because we don't even have to worry about anything then, right? And they just do what they want. Maybe we rebel against them, maybe not, whatever. But the hard form is governing ourselves. And the only thing you need, though, for self-governance to work is a faith in the election system. That's it, right? Because then everything else is fair. It's just you play by the rules at that point. And Donald Trump has tried to convince and has convinced a lot of people that that's not fair. And that's why you have a destabilized situation. So the press has got to take an interest in protecting its free speech to the American people. You know, if somebody attacks the press, for instance, who's the first people to react? And it should be usually the press. Well, look at the stakes if Donald Trump wins again. He's called the press the enemy of the people. And so I think switching from just horse race to horse race and actually what's at stake is going to be important, particularly with these news channels that have opinion pieces to them. From the election perspective, from the campaigning perspective, I just don't know in terms of what, if I was advising the Democrats, I would say, make it very clear what's at stake with people. And it's a worrisome moment, I think, on that.
Do you think there's any chance that Trump won't be the nominee of the Republican Party?
There's a small chance, but not much. I would not put any of my money. Well, if the odds were like really good, maybe I'd put a little bit on somebody else. But I think it's pretty clearly going to be Donald Trump. And I say that not just because of what the polls are looking like, but leadership. This is something that's so amazing to me. When you're a leader and you're put in a position of leadership, what's like the vast majority of that word is to lead, right? To show people something. And it is amazing to me to watch the Republican debate and see, there's like two tiers of influencers in the GOP. There's Donald Trump, he's the only tier one influencer, and then there's everybody else. But if you're a Republican voter, Donald Trump gets indicted, for instance, and you're like, oh, okay, he said it's a witch hunt. And now you're going to watch all these tier two influencers in the debate, and they all start telling you, yeah, it's a witch hunt. Yeah, there's a two-tier justice system. Yeah, Donald Trump didn't do anything wrong. What are you going to believe? Of course you're going to believe he didn't do anything wrong, because everybody else you trust besides the guy is telling you the same thing. And so there's no doubt that all your support then is going to be like, well, let's rally behind the guy that's being targeted by the Department of Justice.
These people are politicians. Don't they realize that when you run against somebody, you have to run against them?
Yeah, it's like, why would you even run? Like, instead of running, then spend your time going out and kissing Donald Trump's backside and hope you can get a position in the administration. It's just...
But it's too hard to run for president to do it for maybe a cabinet post. And a lot of them have been in the cabinet. So what... Are they just under the thumb of a cult leader, or why are they afraid that they won't be everybody's second choice if Trump has a heart attack? Like, what are they thinking? That's it.
So I think if you look at Ron DeSantis' whole campaign, that existed on, I'm going to mimic Donald Trump so that when Donald Trump goes away, I am the one to take all his supporters. I mean, if you believed Donald Trump was going away, it's actually not a bad strategy, right? But the problem is Donald Trump's not going away. And so, yes, I think that's what it is. I think it's just like 2016. I mean, I was a Jeb Bush guy in 2016, and we were sitting around the whole time just like, well, I mean, obviously Donald Trump's going to collapse. And then when he does, then what? But he just never did. And it's the same thing now. They keep thinking, and now they kind of know. So, all the candidates, with the exception of like Chris Christie, he's obviously very outspoken, and Asa Hutchinson, but they obviously know he's going to survive, but now it becomes too scary to do anything about it.
Okay, so I just want to focus on your old district for a second in Bloomington, Illinois, in that area. You were a early John McCain supporter. I covered John McCain in 2000.
You were in his inner circle.
I was on the Straight Talk Express. Yeah. So presumably there are a lot of McCain voters in your district. It sort of has a McCain profile. If Nikki Haley, who's doing pretty well these days, DeSantis is sinking, Haley is rising, if she can convince some of these other candidates to drop out, and she gets a one-on-one shot against Trump in the Illinois Republican primary, does she have a shot in your district?
You know what? My district became so pro-Trump over the last few years that if it was Trump against Haley, I don't think she would win my district. I think in a truly suburban district, maybe in a primary, but I had a lot of rural area, and the rural areas are just, they've gone hardcore Trump. And the interesting thing is when I got elected, it was a swing district. A lot of these, farmers generally voted Republican, but there were a lot that voted Democratic still. Now it's like, if you're a Democratic farmer, you won't admit it, unfortunately, in public. And so it would be difficult, I think, for her to win in that. I think as people drop out, if it goes down to what I think will ultimately be like a race of three people, it'll be like Trump, Chris Christie, and Nikki Haley, then I think you can kind of see the horse race change a little bit. But keep in mind, if DeSantis goes out, he's at 18% now, about half of his support goes to Donald Trump anyway. So it's not like that 18 consolidates behind Nikki Haley.
Right. So if you could explain one or two factors in your district, again, I'm not asking you to speak for the entire United States, just the people who you grew up with, who you knew in the Bloomington area, about why they're in this cult.
Yeah.
What would it be?
First off, it took some time, right? It takes there's two big reasons I like to think about why this is kind of happening. First off, when you start to give a little piece of your soul to justify supporting something or someone, and then you give a little bit of a bigger piece of your soul, and then he meets with Vladimir Putin and says he trusts Putin more than he trusts our intel agencies, so you give a little more of your soul, right? You're sticking it out, and then he does all these things, and ultimately he does January 6th, which was like the biggest piece of your soul. You're like, Well, then to at any point stop and say, I've given too much, or this guy's bad, you have to admit now to yourself, and this isn't just for politicians, this is for anybody that supports him. You now have to admit to yourself that you did a bad thing and you enabled him. And that's tough for humans to admit, all of us, right? We all have that problem. So I think that's part of it. And it becomes about now safety in numbers. So now that you're in a tribe, even if you felt like you had to sell out a lot to get to this moment, others have done the same thing and you find kind of comfort in numbers there. I think that's one of the main reasons that. The other one is just it's just an absolute fear of being kicked out of this tribe. Because I've come to learn, as I've been through being kicked out of a tribe. I've come to realize that people fear that more than they fear death. Many people in this room, or many people in the country, would do a very heroic thing at the cost of their own life. But being kicked out of a tribe and basically living to feel that's really hard, particularly if you're a politician whose whole thing is just being reaffirmed by people. So I think those are a couple of the big factors in it. And lastly, just real quickly, is truly the Midwest does feel like they have been ignored. And I think that's a legitimate feeling. You look at the disappearance of factories, the disappearance of manufacturing, and although it's coming back now, I think it was just this feeling that Washington isn't paying attention to us, and I think that was accelerated after the financial crisis of '08. And Donald Trump came along, he's the most not in touch with the average person guy ever, right? But somehow he's convinced these people that he is. He's going to bring back all their coal jobs in West Virginia. And of course he didn't do that, but they don't even remember that he made that promise.
Let's look at the bright side, and let's assume for a second that Trump loses.
That'd be great.
I'm getting set to cover what I call the coup trial, the one that jury selection starts in February, the big one, the big federal trial. And I've been sort of thinking ahead to possible punishment since putting the Secret Service in jail is a little logistically troubling.
Oh, we'll make it work.
I actually
We'll find a way.
I actually favor 5-day-a-week community service for 20 years.
That'd be
in the
kind
soup
of cool.
kitchen.
Yeah.
He can bring out the sandwiches or ladle the soup, whichever he prefers. But I'm interested in what your thoughts on that. But more important, what happens after Trump is gone? And, you described Fox News as drug pushers. Does this cult survive? Does the MAGA cult survive in a significant way? Or is it more like the Tea Party, which you write about very well in your book, where it does go into the rearview mirror of American politics?
I don't know. And I tend to think that when Donald Trump goes away, it'll be such a defining moment on does MAGA-ism continue or not. And what do I mean by that is who's going to be the person to come and pick up the mantle for the GOP? And this is why I say to all my Democratic friends, you should be rooting, even if you don't want to do it publicly, you should be rooting for a healthy Republican Party, because this country needs two healthy parties, and we only have one healthy one right now. And so let's say Donald Trump, gets abducted by aliens. He's gone. He's out. And here's where the interesting thing. There's not a single person that knows Donald Trump that actually thinks he intended to win in 2016. He ran because it was branding. It was all about branding. But he happened to get in at a time when the Republican Party was ready to break the system. And he came in as a system breaker, and he felt that current took him to victory. I think there is a current in the country as a whole, maybe a little bit in the GOP, I don't know, but in the country of the whole, for somebody to come along and be a healer for the country. And the thing is, you'll never know it until it's happened, because you can't predict these waves. You can only see them in hindsight. And if there is somebody on the Republican side that can come along and be that kind of person, I think they can revolutionize the GOP in a way that Donald Trump did for the negative. If not, though, if everybody running, for instance, for president in 28 or whatever is just, looks at what Donald Trump did and says, I'm going to mimic that, then it's not going to change anything. Because again, leaders do set the temperature for parties and for the country, I think.
So in your book, you say you don't have any interest in running for president. You passed on running for governor or for the Senate from Illinois. But then on your book tour, you're showing a little leg. Like your hat's not quite in the ring, but if you,
that's a good way to put it.
Let me ask it this way. I know you're not going to announce your candidacy right here, but if you did run, would you run as a Republican or an independent?
I have no idea. I mean, I guess my hope is that someday the GOP returns to sanity. I'm a homeless Republican right now. I'm not getting rid of the title because I refuse to let them win. But I certainly don't feel, I'm not pro-Russia in my foreign policy, right? I can go on. And so, I don't know. So in the book, I'm basically I have no interest in running for office again. But that's changed in the last few months, because it's when you're in combat, you don't actually have PTSD while you're fighting a war. It's when you come home. When you come home and the guns are silent, and it's like you take inventory of the impacts this had. So the last 10 months of my life has been taking inventory of the impact that being in Congress, particularly the last 2 years, really had. Family disowns me, a good part of them, not my immediate family, thankfully, but my co-pilot in Iraq sent me a text that said he's ashamed to have ever flown with me. These are tight bonds too. And all of a sudden you realize that took an impact. And so as I've come to terms with that, it's gotten me in a position where I'm like, you know what, maybe I could do this again. But I'm also very conscious to say that, because I don't want anybody thinking that all of this and everything I'm saying about democracy is like some way to just position myself to run for president, because it is not. I have no intention of running. I just know that if I end up being the only guy that is out there telling the truth to people, maybe I would feel compelled to do it at that point. We'll see.
So I'm really curious why there are so few of you. So it was you and Liz Cheney who agreed to go on the January 6th committee, what has turned out to be one of the 2 or 3 most important congressional hearings in all of American history. But these people. Why did I understand why the crazy ones did this? What I don't understand is the level of cowardice among other more moderate Republicans that you served with, and why? Let me ask it this way: were you surprised that you didn't have more company?
I was very surprised. After January 6th, I assumed, I think like probably most of you in here, that the GOP was going to vomit out Donald Trump, right? How could you not? And so when I started to get like really aggressive, I mean, I actually had considered a vote of no confidence against Kevin McCarthy right after January 6th. And to give you an idea of how different of a time it was, I actually thought I might be able to pass that, right, in the conference. But the second he showed up to Mar-a-Lago and got his picture taken with Donald Trump, that turned everything on a dime. Because that was the moment when everybody in the GOP conference, when I say conference, by the way, I'm talking about every Republican member of Congress. Everybody in the conference all of a sudden realized, like, oh my goodness, we're back at it. We have to support Donald Trump again. And I think people have just been beat down enough. I've also learned that everybody wants a chance to do the right thing and change the world. Very few people get a chance to do it as publicly as like what I was able to do. And a fraction of the people that get the chance actually do it. Because it's scary. It's scary until the point you actually pull the trigger, to pardon the pun. But until the point you actually are like, okay, I'm going to do it, and you make the public announcement. So Nancy, here's a quick funny thing. Nancy Pelosi's allies start asking me if I would serve on the January 6th committee, and I didn't want to do it, okay, for obvious reasons. I just was like, no, I did enough, right? I don't want to serve on it. But I knew I couldn't say no because I have a kid, and I could never tell him to do the right thing if I was unwilling. And so I told her allies, yeah, I would do it. And she announced it before I even woke up on a Sunday and told her yes. So I was kind of like, well, I guess I'm doing it now. Yeah. So, she took that fear away from me because she did it for me. But I just think it comes down to the fact that there is a real fear, and that fear is almost impossible to overcome. And no matter shame, no matter, the fact that it's like, okay, well, you're going to be really kind of excoriated in history for making these decisions. I just don't think any of it was enough to compel folks. The number of people that came up to me and said, thank you for what you're doing, but I can't do it because I'll lose my primary. I'm like, do you have any idea what kind of a district I'm from? They're not very happy with me right now. But can I tell you this, ladies and gentlemen? I don't take an oath to the people I represent. You know what? I don't. My oath is not to them. It's to the Constitution, and that's it. And that's all you're accountable to.
I just think when historians, better historians than I am, like look back at this years from now, what you're just talking about is going to be one of the big puzzles, because this is the character test of their generation. So character tests don't come along very often, and they're going to have to live with having flunked the character test just so that they could serve another term or two in the House of Representatives. Like, really? That's worth it? When they know better. The ones who don't know better, the crazy ones, I'm not talking about. I'm talking about the ones who know better. And you write about some of these people in your book. And do you think they will eventually have a reckoning with themselves, or will they just rationalize it for the rest of their lives? No, I think there will be a reckoning. I think there is not a single person today alive who their kids in 10 years are going to ask them what they were doing, and they're not. Let me put this in a better way, because that was getting confusing already. I think anybody in 10 years is never going to admit they were a Donald Trump supporter. Because I think, right now there's deep emotion tied into January 6th and everything that happened, and people have picked a team and they're going to defend the team. In 10 years, that emotion will have worn off, and somebody's kid's going to come up and be like, hey, Dad, did you like Donald Trump? I'm like, hell no, kid. I didn't like Donald Trump. And, he looks back at his dad's Facebook, and he's there with MAGA stuff all over the place. So he's like, oh, we could delete Facebook? I didn't know that. Anyway. So I think there will be a grand reckoning. And I'll tell you, I don't know when it is. Is it going to be in a year or 5 or 10 years? I don't know. But that's one of the reasons I thought the January 6th committee was so important is, first off, there wouldn't have been a DOJ investigation without us. I know that for a fact. And secondly, we've set the record to what it should be. And my kid, who's 2 now, is not going to learn in school that it was the DOJ that did it, or the FBI, or Antifa. He's going to learn that it was a Donald Trump launched insurrection, and that's what he needs to learn. I'll just say real quickly, too, I never understood, when I always learned about the rise of the Nazis in Germany, I never really understood the dynamics of how that happened. What are the brown shirts? How did that work within the Nazis? I get it now. And I'm not
I'm not saying that to say that the Republicans are Nazis. I'm not saying that. But you can see a dynamic where intense elements of a party intimidate everybody else into silence and complicity. And that should frighten all of us.
And we... Before we open it up for questions, I do want to ask you about the Middle East, because there are a lot of people, including a lot of people on the left, who've lost their moral bearings in this case as well. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, look, October 7th was like one of the worst days. And for the Jewish people, it was the worst day since really the end of the Holocaust. Israel has every right to defend itself. Hamas is a cancer that has to be destroyed. And I ask this, like, Hamas was charged with governing the Palestinian people, and they spent a significant amount of their money building tunnels to hide people, to hide weapons, and to move. They didn't spend any money building bomb shelters for their folks. I hear people tell me all the time, Israel should be more precise with their strikes. And look, I agree. Everybody needs to be as precise as you can with your strikes. The fact that Israel's dropped 5,000 or 6,000 bombs and there's 8,000 or 9,000 people that have died in Gaza goes to show that they're being very accurate with their strikes. Because if they were bombing indiscriminately, there'd be close to 100,000 dead today. So look, I think we need to empower Israel to do whatever it needs to do to defend itself. And that's where I stand on that. And that and Ukraine are the fights of our generation right now.
So Biden has introduced a package that would bring together funding for Ukraine, for Israel, some humanitarian money, some money for the border, big package. The new Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, who I'd be interested in your views on him since you serve with him, is trying to unravel that package. How do you think that's going to play out?
Well, it's going to be tough because, I do think when they passed the Israel aid with the IRS offset, which just goes to show how unserious they are because they make it the IRS because then they can go on, Fox and attack the IRS, right? What they did is they sent that to the Senate, and I believe they passed it. They sent it to the Senate. The Senate now has a vehicle by which they can tack on Ukraine. They can strip the offset. They can tack on Taiwan and the border. And I'm not confident enough to say this will happen for sure, but I still believe that ends up getting punted back to the House with all that, and they will end up relenting ultimately and putting that on the floor for a vote. I mean, that way the will of the House has its way. It's going to pass overwhelmingly, but isn't that the point of the House is if most people agree, you should pass it?
But can Johnson just say, I'm not putting this on the floor?
In theory, but I think the real pressure point comes at the government shutdown, which probably will happen, by the way, this time. And I think there will be a pressure point where the government is shut down. Ultimately, they have to reopen, and probably these aid bills are part of that negotiation because it's just going to be a mess, by the way. And that's probably all the House GOP is going to be able to do in the next year and a half, which for most of you in this room is probably a good thing, I would agree. But on Mike Johnson, I'll just say this. I barely knew him. My main interaction with him was when he tried to get me to sign on to this Texas lawsuit to throw out all these votes in Michigan and everywhere else. And I'm like, Mike, you obviously have no clue who you're asking this to, because that time even I was the most outspoken. But if you looked at any of the arguments made by the people that voted to object to the election, they were all citing arguments, constitutional arguments made by Mike Johnson. And so I think he is just a well-dressed insurrectionist.
You said constitutional arguments. What you meant to say was unconstitutional.
Unconstitutional arguments. Yeah.
All right, we're going to. Before we open up for questions, we didn't have time to talk about Adam's youth, but it's really interesting in this book, and you can see from reading the book why he developed into an independent-minded person. So not everybody has as interesting early life as you did in that very, very conservative church you were raised in. And
Independent fundamental Baptist.
Yeah. No smoking, no dancing. And if you
Can't go to movies, but we changed.
And
that's crazy.
One of your friends got in trouble for using the expression "son of a biscuit."
Yeah. because God knows what you meant, boy. Real quick, funny story about that, too. I showed up to go to Six Flags Great America with my youth group, and I was wearing shorts because it was 100 out. They drove me back to my house and made me put on jeans. Because all the ladies would lust at these knees here. And we get off the bus at Six Flags, and I remember hearing some kids walk by go, I wonder if they're Amish.
Okay. Questions? Somebody?
All right. Thank you, everybody. We've reached the Q&A portion of our program today. Please raise your hand, and one of us will come to you with a microphone. Please speak slowly and clearly into the microphone and keep your questions concise. Your first question is in the back right here.
Oh, okay. Great.
When Trump was in office, Zelensky became the president of the Ukraine. It seemed like he didn't embrace him, or there was some like diplomatic snub of some sort. Should it have been different? Should he have embraced Zelensky, had him over to the White House, or gone to see him and congratulate him? Was there any like diplomatic message sent? And what was your thought between the two of them?
Yeah, I mean, look, Trump only cared about one thing with Zelensky, and that is, can he get dirt on Joe Biden? Trump feels an affection to Russia. You know, I'm not of the camp that believes that he necessarily like has business interests in Russia, and that's why I just think he loves strongmen for whatever, sick reason. And I think one of his early interactions with Zelensky was that call where he called and said, hey, do us a favor. Zelensky, to his credit, resisted, right? He was kind of a new president trying to feel things out. You can imagine, I mean, look, there is a history of corruption in all of the Russia and, the former Russian republics, and Ukraine is doing a much better job than the rest of the area to push back against that. But you can imagine that getting a call like that, particularly with the reformers, kind of like, well, this is how things used to be. I mean, that's what he would expect to get from somebody like Vladimir Putin. So, yeah, I mean, obviously Donald Trump should have reached out to Zelensky, should have brought him in. They were eager to attack Barack Obama, which I did too, for the lack of support of Ukraine after 2014. But Donald Trump did the same thing. And it was only really until Joe Biden got in when Ukraine really started to get its offensive, or I guess defensive weapon capability. So, I wish it had been very different.
And you regret voting against the first impeachment?
Yeah, that's one of my big regrets. And I talk about how that was a cowardice move because, in a way I survived, because if I'd have voted for that first impeachment, I wouldn't have been around for the January 6th stuff. But I don't use that as an excuse because too many people say, well, I have to vote this way so that I can survive, so that nobody worse comes behind me. I found a technical argument to get out of it. And it's a big regret I have. And I think it's important for us to admit those regrets instead of pretending like, in my mind, everything I ever did was so courageous that, gosh. Like, you need to know that even people like me at certain times made very cowardice decisions. I regret it. But, I think that also helped me on January 6th to say, like, I'm done. I can't do this. I can't shed any more of my soul for this guy.
Okay, next.
Your next question is over to your right, in the back of the house again.
Hello? Okay. Hi. My question is the pairing of the contribution to Israel and stopping the FBI or the CIS or whoever it is, IRS. Isn't that an outrageous, stupid, anti-American, everything?
Yeah, great question. It is. Yeah, I mean, it's, look, we do have a huge problem with the national debt. Let's be clear, and I think we all have to admit that. And it's gonna take all of us putting things on the table that we don't want to fix this. But to say that you're going to help Israel by basically gutting IRS is just nonsensical anyway, because you're taking away the ability to enforce taxes, which is how the government gets its money. We know this. I'm just wasting time by telling you this. You know it. So, yeah, I think it's dumb.
It sort of reflects the intellectual bankruptcy of the Republican Party right now.
Yeah, because it's not serious. They just can go to Fox.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Your next question is up here.
Hi, I just wanted to switch gears a little bit, if that's okay. First of all, thank you for your military service and your
Thank you.
service.
Thanks.
I wanted to ask you about the book, and I know that you hope everybody reads your book, but if you could envision what we call the ideal reader of the book, when you were writing the book, developing the voice of the book, who did you imagine sitting down and reading it?
That's a great question. And by the way, if you're an Audible type or audiobook, I read it, and my voice was better than it is now. No, it's a great question because it's like, so when I decided to do this, I didn't want to write a book. I'll just be clear because it feels arrogant to me. And somebody told me once, they're like, writing a book feels arrogant if it's about yourself, but it's not, And what I realized is my story tells the bigger story of what's happened in the party because I've lived it and I've seen it, and I talk about those moments and where different points where things have happened. So I would see the ideal reader as the person who is kind of interested in saying, where did the Republican Party go wrong? And how could somebody like me have been part of it for 12 years and not seen what, a lot of folks say, oh, we've seen this forever. Well, that kind of gives you an idea. And I also hope it's for the average kind of Republican that I would consider sort of like me, that's not a crazy Republican that feels homeless, that can look at this and it gives them permission to move on from the party. Because your party identity becomes a real significant part of your identity. And the idea of leaving and losing that identity is hard. And it's like leaving a church, and I talk about that in the book. And so I hope it gives people that are on the edge of that permission to say, it is okay to leave the party. And you can maybe come back someday, but right now it's poisonous.
Your next question is over to your right.
First off, Mr. Kinzinger, you're a hero.
Oh,
and
thanks.
I am so proud that you're from the state of Illinois.
Thank you. Can I just say before you finish that, though, I really, truly don't consider myself a hero. I just was surrounded by a bunch of cowards.
John McCain used to say, I was in the company of heroes, but you can't say that.
All right, since the GOP is a dying carcass, if you were charged with assembling a new GOP, who would you have on your team? Who are still some of the sane actors out there? And just a couple bullet points of what you'd really want to stress as a sane center-right party.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm at a moment where anybody that's really kind of gone along with the Trump thing, I'm not a big fan of. So I don't, in terms of folks that are in politics now, you've pretty much had to go along to stay there. But somebody like in the model of, that most of you probably don't know, Jamie Herrera Butler from Washington State. She's one of the ones that voted to impeach with me. Peter Meyer from Michigan. And again, he's way more libertarian than me. We didn't agree on anything on foreign policy. But I had quite a bit of respect for him because he truly believed that he served as well. I'd look at somebody like, I think people in those vein. To an extent, Nikki Haley, Chris Christie, because he's telling the truth. But here's the thing that I think needs to happen. I think 24 is going to be a tough year. I think 2028 is going to be an amazing American year because there's going to be all kinds of new blood in the Democratic Party and in the Republican Party. Finally, again, I hope, competing on ideas. And what I'd love to see, and frankly, if I ran for president, this is what I would do, is to say, everybody ram dump out of your mind, like everything you've believed, and let's just start over thinking about this stuff. We're still arguing tax rates with the same arguments we used for 120 years. We're talking about income inequality the same way we have for 100 years. Somebody out there has the answer to income inequality because we've tried raising taxes and we've tried cutting them, and that doesn't work. We still have massive income inequality. Somebody's got the idea that's not me. Let's get that idea. Why is it that the inner city and rural America are diametrically opposed to each other right now, politically, when they're facing the exact same issues? Broken homes, hopelessness, drugs, gangs, right? That's what I want to see the new Republican Party, or the new whatever party, call it the gazebo party. I don't even care what it's called. Frankly, the new Democratic Party is just a whole new influx of ideas for the 21st century and just revolutionize how we see things. Conservatism and liberalism was a new thought at one point in history. It's time for a new thought.
May I say one more thing to push back against Mr. Alter's citing the polls? remember right around this time, the last election cycle, everyone was calling for a red wave. And they got that horrifically wrong. I'm not to say that we shouldn't, as center or left-leaning folks, not be very concerned, but the media totally dropped the ball that last time.
You got to run like you're 5 points behind. Yep.
We have our final question over
Oh,
here.
sorry, everybody. We'll see you after, though.
Thank you so much for coming today. My question has to do as someone who's a younger voter. I look at social media and I get really concerned that
yeah, me
people
too.
are watching these videos and based off the algorithm, they get deeper and deeper into borderline conspiracy theories and they take that as fact. Going into this year, what can the Democratic Party really do to help mitigate that? Because I think what we saw during the MAGA years, that was a huge issue and people think that TikTok is fact.
Thank you. Thanks for asking this question. Can I be very clear? When I say something, if like I'm saying, hey, Democrats, be aware of this, I'm not attacking Democrats. I'm trying to give advice because I've lived through this. First off, I just want to say, personally, TikTok is a terrible instrument, okay? Now, I know everybody's using TikTok. But if I told you the FBI was watching what you wrote on Facebook, you'd go ape, as you should. But when I say like, hey, the CCP knows what you're putting on TikTok, people are like, whatever, right? But it's going to exist. It's going to be around. So 2 things. Number 1, from a democratic perspective, is understand that drives and that engages young voters and use it, okay? But also only push back with truth. You can use emotion, but only use truth in that process. You have to police yourself as a political party. The one thing I also want to say to Democrats is, look, you have every right to mimic and copy what the Republican Party has been doing. But please don't, because if you do, we don't have any party that's now holding on to democratic principles. So it may put you at a slight disadvantage when the GOP is willing to go out and just lie about everything, right? But it gives you the moral authority to continue to be that shining party on a hill to actually defend democracy. And the other thing I'll say is this: we're not going to be able to regulate speech. I love seeing things like the lawsuit, the Dominion lawsuit. That's going to be a way within the context of the First Amendment you can hold people accountable. And also, every American is going to have to be accountable for your own news that you consume. If you choose to consume news from only one end of the political spectrum, that's a choice. But I've been talking a lot about civics education because I want people to feel the motivation to see things from both perspectives and make their own decision. So I don't know if I have a magic bullet for it, but the best I can say is be responsible for the own content you consume. And if you have kids, help them be responsible for the content they consume as well. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Thank you so much.